Stepping in the Cracks by Mary Downing Hahn. Chapter 23. That night, while Daddy was listening to the news, Mother and I lingered at the dining room table. The moment we'd gotten home from Gordy's house, Mother had started dinner. She'd kept so busy I hadn't had a chance to talk to her about the Smiths. But now, thinking she'd had plenty of time to come up with a plan, I asked her what we should do. Mother set down her cup and stared at the tea leaves as if she expected to find the answer there. "You can't help a person if they won't admit anything is wrong," she finally said. "Can't Mr. Crawford just go over there and arrest Mr. Smith?" Mother patted my hand. "I know it's hard to understand, Margaret," she said, "but Mrs. Smith is the only one who can ask Mr. Crawford to do that." "She's too scared," I said. "It's a very unfortunate situation," Mother said, "but honestly, Margaret, there's nothing you or I can do." Mother stood up and began gathering our plates and silverware. "It's time to clean up," she said. As far as Mother was concerned, that was that. If Mrs. Smith didn't call the police, no one would. I glanced at her several times, but even when she handed me a dripping plate to dry, Mother didn't look at me. Her profile was stern, uncompromising, her nose sharp, her mouth set in a firm line. There was to be no more discussion of our visit to the Smiths. Gordy's life was as cracked as an old platter I was drying, and Mother had no glue to fix it with. The next afternoon, Mother and I went back to the train tracks. Our tree was lying on the sled where we'd left it, all alone in the melting snow. It looked as if it had been cut down for nothing. Silently, we dragged the tree home and put it up all by ourselves. Even with extra branches tied on to fill in the worst gaps, it was too tall and skinny to be pretty. The glass balls and icicles and colored lights helped, but every time I looked at it, I thought about Gordy and June and Mrs. Smith. After we came home from church on Christmas, our family exchanged gifts. Mother gave me a Sonia Henny doll, dressed in a white skating costume, trimmed with real fur. She smiled with parted lips to show her tiny teeth. As I examined her ice skates, Mother said it was hard to admit I was getting too old for dolls. "You don't have to play with her," she said. "She's just so pretty. I couldn't resist her." I laid the doll carefully back in her box, her eyes closed, and I smiled at Mother. "She's beautiful," I said, "and I love her." Thinking of Barbara's storybook doll collection, I decided to put Sonia in a safe place on top of my bureau, unlike my old dolls, who are losing their hair, missing their toes, fingers, and most of their clothes. She would stay just the way she was now, as perfect as the day she was made. While Mother and Daddy watched, I opened my other presents. A new Nancy Drew mystery, a collection of Edgar Allan Poe's stories, and a dark green sweater set. On the practical side, Mother had also given me an assortment of pajamas, underwear, and socks. Snuggling up against Mother, I gave her my gift, the same brand of cologne she asked for every year. As usual, she pretended to be surprised and gave me a big kiss. Daddy held up his present, a pair of Argyle socks and a handkerchief, as if he never expected to receive anything like them. Then he and Mother gathered all the wrapping paper and tossed them into the fireplace. As the bright paper curled up in flames, Mother put an arm around me and hugged me. "If only Jimmy was here," she said. "Last summer, I was so sure he'd be home for Christmas, but now, well, I just don't know what to think." Turning away from me, she looked up at Daddy. He shook his head and frowned. Without saying anything, he walked to the living room window and stared past Jimmy's blue star at the remains of the snow. Except for dinner, Christmas was officially over till next year. Around 2, I went to Elizabeth's house, and a small package was my gift for her, a pack of double bubble gum and Hershey bar. Because of the medicine we'd bought for Stuart, neither of us had any money for big presents. The Crawfords always picked their tree from the Boy Scouts lot, so it was bigger and far more beautiful than ours. At its base was a Swiss village of little cardboard houses surrounding an oval mere meant to be a frozen lake. On its surface was a group of tiny metal skaters. Other figures stood in the village streets. On the outskirts was a farm, complete with livestock and tiny fir trees. Every Christmas, Mrs. Crawford set up the village. It was always the same. Each house had its own special place. Each skater had its own special place. Each cow, horse, sheep, and pig had its own special place. Even the goose girl's flock followed her in the same order. Ducks first, then chickens, geese last of all. A Lionel train ran around the village, passing through tunnels and over bridges. No one but Mr. Crawford touched its controls. My father found that very amusing. He claimed Mr. Crawford secretly wanted to be God just to keep the trains running on schedule. But I wish we had a set just like it. I loved watching the engine go round and round, blowing its whistle and puffing out real smoke from tiny capsules. As I knelt down to look for each little figure, I thought how nice it would be if College Hill were a Christmas village. Jimmy and Joe would be home, trading jokes and laughing. So would Donald and Stuart. Even Butch and Harold would be safe in their houses, eating turkey with their families. Every missing soldier would be in his place on the streets of College Hill. Want to see what I got? Elizabeth poked me in the ribs to get my attention. She always received more presents than I did. Mainly because she had lots of aunts and uncles who sent packages every year. Isn't she pretty? Elizabeth held up a beautiful bride doll. Aunt Marge says this is how I'll look on my wedding day. Giggling at the thought of getting married, Elizabeth tossed the doll aside and rooted around in a pile of gifts to find the rest of her treasures. A pile of jigsaw puzzles and games, several Nancy Drew novels, a blue sweater set that matched her eyes, a variety of bubble bath sets, dusting powder, and 3 bottles of cologne. Do you think someone's trying to tell me I have BO? She asked. As she handed me my present, I gave her hers. Before opening them, we looked at each other. The packages were exactly the same size and shape. Laughing, we tore off the paper and discovered we'd given each other the same thing. Popping a piece of the bubble gum in her mouth, Elizabeth jumped to her feet. Let's go out for a while. Lacy patches of snow lay mounded in a shady place under bushes and trees, but the rest was gone. The sky was blue, and it was warm enough to leave our jackets unbuttoned. What both of us had really wanted, bicycles, we hadn't gotten. Daddy said you couldn't get one this year for love or money. So Elizabeth got on Joe's bike, and with me behind her, she pedaled up Garfield Road toward Beach Drive. We'll say Merry Christmas to Stuart, Elizabeth said, steering the bike around puddles of melting slush. The snowman in the Fisher's yard had shrunk to a couple of mounds about the size of softballs. Leaving the bike in the driveway, we rang the doorbell, and Mrs. Fisher let us in. Just go on upstairs, she said. Stuart's wide awake and feeling much better. He should be on his feet next week. Stuart grinned at us from bed. He and Barbara were playing a game of chess, and Brent was pushing a new wooden train around the floor, making little choo-choo sounds. The Victrola was playing Swinging on a Star, and Stuart asked us if we'd ever carried moonbeams at home in a jar. We were all laughing when Gordy suddenly appeared in the doorway. He scowled as usual at the sight of Elizabeth and me, but Stuart beckoned to him. Come here, Gordo, he said. His voice was still hoarse, but he wasn't coughing as much. Merry Christmas. Stuart added as Gordy settled down beside him on the bed. His eye was better, and the bruises had faded. If you weren't very observant, you probably wouldn't have noticed them. Where have you been? Stuart asked. I haven't seen you for days. Gordy shrugged. I had stuff to do. Gordy looked at him closely. How are Mom and the kids? They're okay. Gordy fiddled with the wrapper from the piece of chocolate Stuart had given him. He folded it smaller and smaller, creasing it with his thumbnail. It's the old man, isn't it? Stuart took Gordy's face between his hands and lifted it gently toward him. In the soft light, he stared at the faded bruises. That's why you didn't come. He hit you. Gordy pulled away and slid off the bed. In the sudden silence, Bing Crosby was singing that you can be better than you are if you just swing on a star. I'm okay, Gordy said. He did this the day we took you to the doctor. You were too sick to notice it then. Stuart closed his eyes and lay back against the pillow. His face was chalky white. Alarmed, Barbara bent over him, but he shook his head. Here I am, lying in the lap of luxury, and Mom and the kids have nobody to protect them. What kind of person am I? Scared to go to war, scared to hold a gun, scared of my own father. Stu, Barbara said, don't talk like that. There's nothing you can do. Stuart lay back and closed his eyes. Across the room, Gordy kept his back to us. He didn't say anything either. The Victrola needle went click, 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 but nobody moved to turn it off. Choo-choo, Brent said. He crawled across the floor and pushed his train against Gordy's shoe. Toot-toot. Barbara scooped him up and hugged him, but he squirmed to get down. Still holding him, Barbara said, Hasn't anybody tried to help? Gordy wheeled around and glared at me. Stupid Magpie's mother came to our house, poking her nose in. Fat lot of good that did. You should have stuck around, you and your mother, to see what happened after you left. He stared at me for a second. Busted Mom's arm, that's what he did, Gordy said in a low voice. Then he took her to the hospital and told them she fell down the basement steps. Come back again sometime, Magpie, if you and your mother want some excitement. Maybe he'll punch you out, too. Elizabeth, Barbara, and I huddled together. The chessboard had tumbled to the floor when Gordy jumped off the bed, and all the pawns and kings and queens lay scattered on the rug. The vaporizer hissed. The Victrola needle continued to click against the record, and Brent managed to wiggle out of Barbara's arms. Toddling across the floor, he picked up his engine and gave it to Gordy. Gordy stared at the toy as if he had no idea what it was for. Then he zipped up his jacket. "I better go," he muttered to Stuart. "I just want to say Merry Christmas." What a laugh. "Hold on." Stuart pushed himself up in bed and started coughing again. "Give me my clothes," he said to Barbara. "I'm going with him." "You aren't going anywhere." Barbara stared at him. "Listen to that cough. Do you want to kill yourself?" "It's okay, Stuart." Gordy bent over the bed. "You know how the old man is. He busted her arm, and now he's sorry. He threw out a whole bottle of whiskey, swore he'd never take another drink." "How many times have we heard that?" Stuart asked. "He's probably going through the garage right now looking for it." "No, he'll be okay for a while. He even brought home a tree and gave Mom some perfume." Gordy patted Stuart's shoulder. "Don't worry. I'm taking care of things." Stuart frowned. "I can't keep hiding. Not from him. Not from the war." "Just stay here till you get well. Please." Gordy lingered in the doorway, his eyes filled with worry. "Are you sure everybody's all right?" Stuart stared at Gordy so hard you'd think he was trying to read his mind. Gordy pointed to his face. "He hasn't touched me since the day Mrs. Goody Baker tried to help." Ashamed, I stooped down and started picking up the chessmen. Mother hadn't meant to make things worse. Like me, she wanted to help. After Gordy left, Barbara remembered the record. Lifting the arm, she turned the Victrola off and sat down beside Stuart. Brent climbed up on the bed and ran his train back and forth over the blue quilt. "Well," Stuart said, looking from Barbara to Elizabeth and me, "it looks like Gordy and I aren't doing much to give you all a Merry Christmas." "It wasn't too merry anyway," I whispered, thinking about Daddy standing at the window, staring at the blue star hanging there, worrying about my brother. Nobody but Elizabeth heard me. On the way home, she said, "I know what you mean, Margaret. With Joe overseas, nothing's the same at our house either." "If only he and Jimmy could come home," I said, "then everything would be all right." Elizabeth glanced over her shoulder at me. "Sometimes I think the war will last forever," she said. "Nothing will ever be like it used to be." And she bent over the handlebars and pedaled hard. Picking up speed, the old Schwinn flew down the street, bouncing over ruts and splashing our legs and feet with icy gray slush. Chapter 24. Christmas vacation dragged past, full of rain and wind and nothing to do but help Mother. After a week of vacuuming and dusting and polishing silver, it was a relief to go back to school. As much as I hated decimals and percentages, I hated housework more. After what we'd been through together, I thought Gordy would be friendlier to Elizabeth and me, but he was just as nasty as ever. When I tried to catch his eye on the playground, he turned his head to the side and spit in the dirt. Even worse, he stole Elizabeth's lunch bag and ate everything except her apple. Looking her in the eye like he was daring her to tell, he threw the apple in the trash. Elizabeth and I weren't the only ones Gordy was mean to. Except for Doug and Toad, he seemed to be mad at the entire world. Even Mrs. Wagner had trouble making him behave. As a result of talking in class, acting rude, and not doing his homework, Gordy spent a lot of time standing in the hall or staying after school scrubbing blackboards and pounding the chalk dust out of erasers. No matter how Gordy felt, he couldn't keep Elizabeth and me from visiting his brother. Stuart was out of bed by the middle of January, but he was still too weak to do any more than sit in a chair. He looked better, though, and I thought he was beginning to gain a little weight. One afternoon, Elizabeth and I were walking home from the Fisher's house. Barbara was with us, pushing Brent in his stroller. He was too big for his carriage now, and he liked feeling the wind in his face. Opening his mouth, he gulped in air the way a dog does when it sticks its head out a car window. "What's Stuart going to do when he gets well?" Elizabeth asked Barbara. For a moment, Barbara didn't answer. We'd just crossed the trolley tracks, and she paused on the corner to wait for a car to go by. Dartmoor Avenue stretched ahead of us, long and straight, striped with the shadows of trees. A handover of leftover leaves whirled around our feet, and Brent leaned over the side of the stroller to see what was making the rustling sound under the wheels. He laughed and bounced up and down. "I don't know," Barbara said. "Stu hasn't decided yet." "Sometimes I think he should just go back to the army," Elizabeth said, "and other times I think he shouldn't." "He believes killing is wrong," Barbara said. "How can he go overseas feeling like that? It's not like the army needs Stu personally to win the war. Why can't they just leave him alone?" Elizabeth glanced at her, but Barbara was bending over the stroller, checking on Brent. The wind had whipped red splotches on her cheeks, and her hair billowed around her face. Things are getting better in France and Belgium. Barbara straightened up and smiled at Elizabeth. By the time Stu gets well, maybe it'll all be over, and he won't have to go anywhere. Elizabeth nodded her head in agreement. My father says the Russian army is beating the pants off the Nazis. We just got a letter from Jimmy yesterday, I added. He says it's cold, and he's always hungry. He drew a funny picture of himself with a big fat stomach, and under it he wrote, "Me when I get home, and eat Mom's cooking." I looked at Barbara, but she was staring down Dartmoor Avenue at the brick houses sitting on their tidy squares of lawn, one little box after another. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the handle of Brent's stroller. Sometimes I can't believe there really is a war, she said slowly. The whole thing seems like a story, until someone you love dies. Then you know it's real. We walked on a little slower. I was thinking so hard I didn't see Gordy, Toad, and Doug until their bikes skidded to a stop in front of us. Oh no, Elizabeth said. Who let you out of the zoo? Ignoring Elizabeth, Gordy leaned toward Barbara. How's Stuart today? He asked. Instead of looking at her, he bent over to check his front tire. With his head down, the tips of his ears looked bright red. He's pretty good, Barbara said. How about you? Me? I'm fine. And your mother? Gordy glanced at Barbara. She's fine, too. And so's my old man. He got a job at the defense plant across the tracks. The familiar nasty edge in his voice cut at my nerves, but Barbara didn't seem to notice. I'm glad to hear that, she said. When are you coming to see Stu? He misses you. Gordy shrugged elaborately. With you around, I didn't think he noticed whether I was there or not. Turning to Toad and Doug, he said, Come on, let's go. We watched them pedal away, and Barbara sighed. A gust of wind tossed her hair, and she brushed a long strand out of her eyes. Brent bounced in the stroller, and Barbara looked down at him as if she'd forgotten he was there. It's time for Brent's supper, she said. I'll see you girls later. The two of us watched her walk away. Before Barbara disappeared around the corner, she started running, pushing Brent faster and faster, making him laugh. Elizabeth and I waved, hoping she'd look back and see us, but she kept on going. Silently, we turned toward home. The wind rattled the branches over our heads and sent cold fingers down the back of my neck. Except for Elizabeth and me, the street was empty. Suddenly, Elizabeth gave a whoop and ran ahead. Step on a crack, she shouted, stamping hard on the cement. Break Hitler's back. Step on a crack, I echoed, yelling as loud as I could. Break Hitler's back. By the time we reached the corner of Garfield and Dartmoor, we were out of breath. As we leaned against Mr. Zimmerman's fence, trying to breathe normally, Elizabeth turned to me. The wind whipped her curls around her face, and her eyes sparkled. I bet Barbara's in love with Stuart, she said. That's why she doesn't want him to go to war. You're crazy, I said. How could Barbara be in love? She is a baby. Elizabeth rolled her eyes upwards. What on earth does Brent have to do with it? Well, she's a mother, and mothers don't fall in love. Oh, Margaret, don't be such a dumbo. Giving me a friendly shove, Elizabeth ran off down the street. A whirlwind of leaves followed her, and she kicked them away. Last one home's a rotten tomato, she called to me as I sprinted along behind her. See you tomorrow, Magpie. Not if I see you first, lizard. I waved and hurried up my steps, pausing on my porch to return the face she was making at me. Then she ducked inside, the winner as usual. Laughing, I shoved open the front door. As soon as I shut it behind me, I knew something was wrong. Daddy and Mother were sitting on the couch. Daddy had one arm around Mother. In his other hand was a telegram. They were both crying. Motionless, I leaned against the door. My bones turned to water, and I couldn't speak, couldn't ask what was wrong. A huge icy lump filled my throat, cutting off my breath. If I'd been able to move, I could have run out of the house. I didn't want to hear what they were going to tell me. Everybody knew what a telegram meant. It's Jimmy, Mother said at last. I stared at her, paralyzed. The clock on the mantel chimed 4:30, and a branch of the holly tree tapped against the window. On one side of the clock, Jimmy's face smiled at me from a silver frame, young and handsome in his uniform. He's been killed in action, Mother went on in a flat voice. Crumpling the telegram into a tiny wad, Dad hurled it into the fireplace. We watched it uncurl slowly on the cold hearth. But we just got a letter, I whispered. There must be a mistake. Not Jimmy, I prayed. Oh, please, God, not Jimmy. Not my only brother. Mother hid her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with sobs. Daddy touched her arm. Without saying anything, he left the room. In a couple of seconds, the back door opened and then slammed shut behind him. Mother and I stared at each other, and then she held out her arms, and I ran into them like a little child. Neither of us spoke. We just clung to each other and cried. No one ate dinner that night. When Daddy came home several hours later, he told Mother he'd gone for a walk, but he smelled like beer and cigarette smoke. Silently, I watched him stumble into the bedroom and shut the door. In a few minutes, I heard him snoring. Glancing at the kitchen clock, Mother said, "It's past 9. Go to bed, Margaret. There's nothing we can do now." Holding me so tightly I couldn't breathe, Mother kissed me and sent me upstairs. I paused on the landing to look back at her. She was standing in the hall, one hand pressed up against her mouth, tears sliding silently to her cheeks. I wanted to run back to her, to cling to her, to beg her not to send me away all alone, but instead I turned around and crept up the stairs. Before I went into my room, I tiptoed to Jimmy's door. Opening it slowly and quietly, I slipped inside and sat on his bed in the dark. Over my head, his model planes turned slowly, and a draft creeping under the window. His miniature cars sat in a neat line on top of his bookcase. On the wallpaper, cowboys and Indians chased each other around and around the room. It was so quiet, I could hear my own breath going in and out, in and out. "Let it be a mistake, God," I whispered. "Please don't let Jimmy be dead." The wind shook the glass in the window and made a spooky sound in the eaves. A train whistle blew. A dog barked. Downstairs, Daddy snored. I imagined Mother lying beside him, staring into the dark, still crying. I went back to my own room and got into bed. "Don't be dead," I whispered. "Please, Jimmy, don't be dead." The next day, Elizabeth saw my face at my window and waved to me from her backyard. Grabbing my jacket, I went outside. Wordlessly, we walked down to the end of the yard and climbed up into the tree. Sitting on the platform Gordy had built for us, I shivered in the wind. "Mother told me about Jimmy," Elizabeth whispered. "You must feel awful, Margaret." I twisted a braid around my finger and then let it go, watching the coil of hair spring free. "It doesn't seem real," I said. "Jimmy's been over there for more than a year. When I woke up this morning, I couldn't believe it." Elizabeth nodded. "Maybe the Army made a mistake." "That's what I've been hoping." I sighed and played with my braid, twisting it, untwisting it. "Sometimes it happens. There was an article in the Star not long ago about a soldier everybody thought was dead." Elizabeth nodded. "I saw it. He was captured by the Germans, and they mixed him up with someone else." Down the track, a train whistle blew. Elizabeth waved to the engineer as the locomotive thundered past, but I didn't bother. After it was gone, leaving nothing but smoke and cinders behind, Elizabeth said, "Do you feel any different about Stuart now? About his being a deserter and all?" I thought for a moment and shook my head. I wish Jimmy had deserted too. When he left, he told Mother not to cry. "Nothing's going to happen to me," he said. I can still hear him laughing at her for being so upset. Joe said the same thing, Elizabeth said. "I hope he was right." Maybe that's what soldiers have to believe. If they thought they were going to die, they wouldn't go. We sat side by side, watching the clouds scud across the sky. The puddles in the valley had frozen again, and the wind tugged at us, but we stayed in the tree, ignoring the cold, as still as statues. "Look, there's Gordy," Elizabeth said after a while. Head down, hands jammed in his pockets, Gordy trudged slowly toward us. I didn't think he saw us, but when he was directly below us, he looked up. "I heard about Jimmy," he said. "I'm sorry, Magpie." Then, while I stared at him, too surprised to say a word, Gordy walked on. Silently, Elizabeth and I watched him dwindle in the distance and finally disappear around a corner. We looked at each other. Coming from Gordy's mouth, the words had a terrible, undeniable validity. Jimmy was dead. He wasn't ever coming home. Never, never in all my life would I see my brother again. While Elizabeth patted my back, I clung to the tree and cried.